Good evening and welcome to the evening on day 8. I hope your sourdough starters are looking beautiful and bubbly and smelling lovely, and you can actually start to bake with them now. If it's looking nice and bubbly, it has risen at least 30, I'd say, to 50% above where you put your elastic, and is kind of domed on the top. So you could see some nice bubbles in the top has risen. It's given that sort of quilted effect. You could start baking with it. So I'm going to have a look at mine, and if they still look good, I'm going to bake with my gluten-free sourdough starters tomorrow and make a loaf of bread, sourdough bread that's gluten-free and hopefully just delicious. All right, let's go check them out. So here's Susie, our sorghum sourdough starter, and you can see the line there where it has risen and fallen. So the starter is now in its phase of the life cycle of the bacteria and yeast where the yeast are starting to die off because it's becoming too acidic. And yeast do not like acidity. Bacteria do though. And the lactic acid bacteria are creating the acetic acid and lactic acid, which is making it quite sour smelling. And as it gets a little bit older, this is called an old starter. So once it's gone past its peak activity, it has risen and fallen. That's because the yeast has now started to die off. And when the yeast eats, it produces the carbon dioxide that causes it to rise. So when we see it lowering, that means our yeast is starting to die off. And we obviously don't want that, as we want our bread to rise. That's the whole point in making this. So this is the reason why we want to feed our starter when it's at its peak activity. So when we see those signs that it has the dome top, it's risen up and it hasn't fallen yet and it doesn't smell sour. And this way we will be feeding it at its peak activity and keeping the yeast very happy and healthy and as most active as possible to give us the best rise to our bread. You can use an old starter, however, to make a loaf of bread. It will just make a very sour loaf. So we can talk about that later as well. You can see the ridges and valleys, and they're not super prominent yet, which means that it probably just fell not too long ago. It looks a little bit deflated though. And my starter still smells quite sweet. It's just a little bit sour, not too much. So with Susie here, I've just missed her peak activity. So it definitely is ready for a feed. So let's get to it and feed our starter. Give it a good mix as always before. And then we're going to discard all but 30 grams because remember we said that was a really good amount to maintain. And especially once it goes into the refrigerator. Then we're going to feed it 60 grams of water and terrier scale, and 50 grams of flour. And then, of course, back to the good old mixaroo, we're going to mix it for at least 2 minutes until it gets well incorporated. And if you're wondering, why can't I put it in the refrigerator now? It's super active. It's showing all of these signs that it is ready to bake with. And the answer is, I guess, that you can. But I find that it takes about 2 weeks of feeding your starter regularly and that many feeds a day in order for it to gain the strength to give a really good rise to your bread. So if we want to make sure that we get that as soon as possible, I'd recommend leaving it on the counter for these 2 weeks and then being all ready to bake at the end of the 2 weeks. At the end of the series, I'll explain to you exactly what to do in order to maintain your starter in the fridge and to create your first leaven, to bake your first gluten-free sourdough. And I'll also explain why it's best to leave your starter in the refrigerator and only take it out to create your leaven when you want to bake bread. So check the level of your elastic and cover your starter back up and place it in its snuggly spot. And remember, don't throw away your discard. You can bake with it now. And I've put all sorts of exciting and fun ideas into the post below. So if you make something, please share with us. I would love to see some pictures. And we will get together again in the morning and feed our starters. I hope you have the most peaceful and beautiful sleep. Good night.